We all have a hunger for new experiences, for things that tantalize the senses and push the boundaries of the known. But what if the ultimate delicacy came at an unspeakable price? What if the most exclusive meal you could ever eat was made from a secret ingredient that would stain your soul forever? The tale you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. It is a journey into a world of culinary perfection and moral depravity, a story of a feast so unforgettable it becomes a curse. It will make you question the nature of taste, memory, and the darkness that can lurk behind the most sophisticated facade. Before we serve up the first course of this nightmare, if you have an appetite for horror that gets under your skin and lingers long after the story is over, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. You wouldn't want to miss a single bite. Now, settle in, and let us tell you about a restaurant called Le Festin Eternel. The world of haute cuisine is a kingdom of whispers. Rumors of a reclusive genius, a hidden gem, or an impossible-to-get reservation travel through its upper echelons like currency. For years, the most persistent and intoxicating whisper was of a place that had no name, no address, and no public profile. It was known only as the Chef's Table, a clandestine dining experience curated by a culinary phantom known only as Antoine Dubois. To be invited was to be anointed, a confirmation that you were one of the true conoscenti. The criteria for an invitation were unknown. It was said the chef chose his guests based on their palate's purity and their capacity for transcendence. Liam Croft was a man who had built his career on such whispers. As the lead restaurant critic for the Global Epicurean, his palate was his weapon and his prose was his scalpel. He was a man jaded by 1,000 perfect soufflés and 1,000,000 deconstructed classics. He had grown weary of the culinary world's relentless posturing, its fads and its foams. He craved something authentic, something that would shock his senses back to life. He had heard the rumors of Dubois for years, dismissing them as a cleverly orchestrated marketing gimmick, another emperor with no clothes. Yet, a part of him, the young, hopeful foodie that still existed deep beneath the layers of his cynicism, yearned for it to be true. The invitation, when it came, was the antithesis of a gimmick. It was a single, heavy card of handmade paper, delivered by a silent courier. There was no ink, only pinpricks forming a single date and a set of geographic coordinates. There was no RSVP. It was understood that one did not decline such a summons. The coordinates pointed to a disused pier on the industrial side of the city's waterfront, a place of rust and forgotten things. Liam wasn't the only one chosen. Chloe Reed, a food blogger whose star was on a meteoric rise, received an identical card. Where Liam was cynical, Chloe was a true believer. Her blog, The Gastronomic Soul, was a testament to her belief in food as an emotional, almost spiritual experience. She wrote with a passionate, lyrical prose that connected with millions of followers. For her, an invitation from the mythical Dubois was like a summons from a god. It was the culmination of everything she had ever worked for. The third recipient was Ben Carter, a portly, boisterous venture capitalist who collected restaurant reservations the way he collected vintage watches. For Ben, food was not about soul or art. It was about status. Eating at a place no one else could get into was the ultimate conquest. He saw the invitation as a trophy, another story to be told with a theatrical flourish at his exclusive country club. On the appointed night, under a starless, ink-black sky, the three of them converged at the designated coordinates, along with three other guests: a stern-looking Japanese art dealer, a celebrated Italian opera singer, and a young, unervingly beautiful French socialite. They were strangers, united only by the cryptic piece of paper in their pockets. A sleek, unmarked black car materialized out of the gloom, its windows opaque. A driver, dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored black suit, opened the door without a word. The guests were each handed a velvet blindfold. A request from the chef. The driver's voice was a low, toneless hum. The journey is the first part of the sensory experience. Liam scoffed internally at the theatricality, but complied. The car smelled of old leather and something else, a faint, metallic, coppery scent he couldn't quite place. The journey was long and winding, a deliberate disorientation. When the car finally stopped, They were led by the hand, still blindfolded, through what felt like a heavy, soundproof door. The air changed instantly. It was warm, humid, and thick with an aroma that was both intoxicating and deeply unsettling. It was savory, rich, and earthy, but with an undercurrent of something else, something primal and vaguely sweet, like a butcher shop next to a perfumery. Their blindfolds were removed. They stood in a room that was a study in minimalist opulence. The walls were unadorned, polished concrete, but the single long table was carved from a single piece of ancient, dark wood. The lighting was low, a series of spotlights that illuminated only the place settings, leaving the rest of the room in deep shadow. There was no kitchen in sight, no clatter of pots and pans, no shouts of a busy staff. The silence was absolute, almost reverent. A figure emerged from the shadows. He was tall and gaunt, with a face that seemed carved from alabaster. He wore not a traditional chef's uniform, but a simple, high-collared black tunic. His eyes were the most striking feature, pale, piercing gray that seemed to look not at his guests, but through them, assessing and dissecting. This had to be Antoine Dubois. "Welcome," he said. His voice a soft, cultured baritone with a faint, unplaceable European accent. "You are here tonight not merely to eat, but to experience. Food is memory. It is emotion. It is the very essence of life, captured and transformed. What we consume becomes a part of us, literally and spiritually. Tonight, I will offer you a feast that you will never forget, a feast that will become a part of you. Welcome to Le Festin Eternal Feast." The meal began. There were no menus. Each course was presented by Dubois himself, who would emerge from the shadows with a single plate for each guest, describe it in poetic, almost philosophical terms, and then retreat, leaving them to their experience. The first course was a tear of the sea, a single perfect oyster resting in a pool of translucent, savory jelly that tasted of mist and oceanic melancholy. It was followed by a breath of the forest, a sliver of rare, wild mushrooms served on a shard of petrified wood. Its flavor so intensely earthy it felt like inhaling the forest floor after a rainstorm. Each dish was a masterpiece, pushing the boundaries of what Liam, Chloe, and Ben thought they knew about food. The flavors were complex, alien, yet somehow hauntingly familiar. They seemed to tap into some primal, prelinguistic part of the brain. Chloe was in heaven, her mind already composing rapturous prose. Ben was loudly proclaiming it the greatest meal of his life. Even Liam, the hardened cynic, found his defenses crumbling. He was experiencing something new, something profound. The wine, a deep, viscous red, was unlike anything they had ever tasted. It was rich and full-bodied, but with a distinctly sanguine, irony quality that coated the tongue. The blood of the earth, Dubois had called it when he served it, fermented in volcanic soil, where the ground itself is alive. As the meal progressed, the atmosphere in the room grew stranger. The initial excitement of the guests gave way to a kind of quiet, introspective intensity. The silence between courses grew longer, heavier. Liam noticed the coppery scent he had detected in the car was stronger here, a faint but persistent note beneath the complex aromas of the food. He looked around the table. The other guests' faces, illuminated in the spotlights, were flushed, their eyes glazed over with a strange, euphoric intensity. Finally, Dubois emerged for the main course. He placed a heavy, covered ceramic bowl before each guest. "Everything you have tasted tonight has been a prelude," he said, his voice dropping to an almost hypnotic whisper. "A preparation of the palate for the final truth. Most chefs work with the flesh of animals, the bodies of plants. They are capturing a life that has passed. I seek to capture something more. I seek to capture the essence of a life's passion. This terroir, a musician's dexterity, a poet's sorrow, an athlete's vigor. Tonight's main course is what I call the essence del home, a stew that has been simmering for 72 hours. It is the culmination of a unique and vibrant life. It is my greatest honor to share it with you." He lifted the lids. A cloud of fragrant steam billowed forth, filling the room with that same, deeply unsettling aroma-rich, sweet, savory, and undeniably meaty. The stew was a deep, dark crimson, almost black, with pieces of unidentifiable meat so tender they seemed to quiver in the thick, glossy broth. There were root vegetables, dark herbs, and what looked like small, pearlescent onions. Hesitantly, Liam took his first bite. The texture was sublime, a meat that was richer than veal, more tender than pork, with a subtle gaminess like the finest venison, but with a flavor profile that was entirely unique. It was sweet, yet profoundly savory, with a deep, lingering finish that seemed to coat his very soul. He looked up and saw the others eating with a silent, ravenous intensity. Chloe's eyes were closed in ecstasy. Ben was spooning the stew into his mouth with a gusto that bordered on obscene. It was, without question, the most delicious thing Liam had ever eaten. It was transcendent, a flavor that seemed to rewrite the very language of his palate. He cleaned his bowl, as did everyone else at the table. A strange, languid euphoria settled over them, a deep sense of contentment and well-being that was almost narcotic. When the meal was over, Du Bois appeared one last time. He did not ask them how they enjoyed the food. He simply looked at them, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. "The feast is now a part of you," he said. "It will not be forgotten. Cannot be." They were blindfolded once more and led back to the car. The journey back was silent, each guest lost in a private, post-prandial haze. When Liam was dropped off a block from his apartment, he felt dazed, transformed. The world seemed different, the colors more vivid, the sounds sharper. But as he walked home, the lingering taste of the stew in his mouth, a taste he could not define, began to feel less like a memory and more like a presence. A stain. The whisper of Le Festin Eternal had been true, but he had a chilling, nascent feeling that the story was far from over. The feast had been eternal, and the price had yet to be paid. The days following the eternal feast were, for Liam, Chloe, and Ben, a slow descent into a sensory hell. The initial euphoria, the feeling of culinary transcendence, curdled into something sour and deeply disturbing. The world, which had seemed so vivid and new in the immediate afterglow of the meal, now felt muted and wrong, as if they were listening to a familiar song played in a discordant key. The true horror began not with a ghost or a monster, but with something far more intimate and inescapable. The taste. For Liam, the jaded critic, the taste was a constant, phantom presence on his tongue. It was the first thing he noticed upon waking and the last thing he was aware of before succumbing to a restless, dream-plagued sleep. No amount of coffee, mints, or astringent mouthwash could erase it. The complex, sweet, and savory flavor of the essence still home clung to his palate, a ghostly residue that tainted everything else he tried to eat. A perfectly cooked steak tasted like ash. A fresh, crisp apple tasted of rot. His own tools of the trade, his highly refined senses, had been corrupted. They no longer belonged to him, but it was more than just a lingering flavor. It was as if the stew had implanted something within him. He began to experience strange, fleeting sensory glitches. Sometimes, while typing a review, his fingers would move with an unfamiliar, almost alien dexterity, his hands seeming to know the keyboard in a way his mind did not. He would be walking down the street and be struck by a sudden, overwhelming wave of stage fright, his palms sweating, his heart hammering, even though he was completely alone. And then there were the dreams. He dreamt of hands, not his own, gliding effortlessly over the keys of a piano, playing a melody that was both beautiful and heartbreakingly sad. He would wake with the phantom melody echoing in his head, a tune he had never heard before but knew with an impossible intimacy. Chloe, the passionate blogger, experienced a different kind of haunting. For her, it was a scent, a delicate, complex fragrance of lavender, old paper, and a faint hint of rain on stone. It would appear at random, a ghostly miasma that would envelop her, blotting out all other smells. It was a deeply personal, intimate scent, the kind of perfume a person wears their entire life. With the scent came a crushing, inexplicable wave of melancholy, a profound sense of loss for someone she had never known. She would burst into tears in the middle of the grocery store, overwhelmed by a grief that was not her own. Her own vibrant, optimistic personality was being overwritten by a stranger's sorrow. Her writing, once so full of joy and life, became dark, elegiac. Her followers noticed, flooding her comments with concerned questions. How could she explain that she was mourning a ghost she had consumed? Ben Carter's haunting was the most visceral and grotesque. The feast had awakened a hunger in him that could not be sated. He, a man who had always prided himself on his Epicurean appetite, was now possessed by a ravenous, primal craving. He ate constantly, his consumption escalating from expensive delicacies to greasy fast food, and then to raw meat straight from the butcher's wrapping. Nothing satisfied him. The only thing he truly craved was the one thing he could never have again: the stew. The hunger was a physical pain, a gnawing emptiness in his gut that no amount of food could fill. Worse still were the phantom pains. He would be jolted awake in the night by a searing, sharp pain in his side, a phantom wound that had no physical cause. He would clutch his abdomen, gasping, sweat beading on his forehead, until the sensation faded, leaving him trembling and terrified. He went to doctors who ran a battery of tests and scans, only to find nothing physically wrong with him. He was perfectly healthy, they said, yet he felt like he was being eaten alive from the inside out. His body, which he had always treated as a vessel for pleasure, had become a house of horrors. A week after the dinner, unable to bear the sensory torment any longer, Liam decided to act. He tried to find any information about Chef Du Bois or Lou Festin Eternal. He scoured the internet, dug through his extensive network of contacts in the culinary world, and came up with absolutely nothing. It was as if the restaurant, the chef, and the other guests had never existed. The pier where they had been picked up was deserted, bearing no trace of their clandestine meeting. There was no record, no evidence, nothing but his own corrupted memory. In desperation, he reached out to the only other person he knew how to contact from that night: Chloe. He found her blog and sent a cryptic email. The taste. It won't go away. Her reply came within minutes. For me, it's a smell. Liam, what's happening to us? What was in that food? They agreed to meet, joined by a frantic Ben, whom Liam had managed to track down through a mutual acquaintance. They met in a sterile, anonymous coffee shop, a stark contrast to the opulent darkness of the feast. As they shared their experiences, a dawning, collective horror settled over them. Liam's phantom finger memory, Chloe's ghostly perfume and borrowed grief, Ben's insatiable hunger and phantom wound. Their stories were different, yet terrifyingly similar. They were not suffering from a shared delusion or a case of food poisoning. They were haunted. He said it would become a part of us, Chloe whispered, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. He said he captured the essence of a life's passion, a musician's dexterity, a poet's sorrow. What are you saying? Ben snapped, his voice tight with panic. That I'm feeling some dead athlete's side stitch? That's insane. Is it? Liam countered, his voice low and grim. What did he call it? The essence del home? The essence of man. It wasn't a metaphor. We have to face the possibility that what we ate that night, it wasn't just meat. The unspoken word hung in the air, heavy and monstrous. Human. They were unwilling cannibals. The thought was so vile, so far beyond the pale of civilized comprehension, that their minds recoiled from it. And yet, it was the only explanation that fit their shared nightmarish experience. The unique, unforgettable flavor, the strange, specific sensory hauntings. They had consumed not just the flesh, but the very essence, the memories and pains, of the people who had been served to them. Meanwhile, across the city, Detective Isabella Rossi was staring at a corkboard of cold cases. She was a sharp, tenacious investigator with a reputation for seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. Her attention was focused on a series of missing persons reports from the past year. On the surface, they were unconnected. A celebrated concert pianist, Julian Croft, no relation to Liam, who had vanished from his locked apartment 6 months ago. A reclusive, genius perfumer, Elodie Renault, who disappeared 3 months later, leaving behind only a half-finished formula for a new scent. And the most recent, a promising young marathon runner, Marco Valles, who had gone for a training run 2 months ago and never returned. There was no sign of struggle, no ransom notes, no clues. They had simply ceased to exist. But Rossi saw a pattern. Each of them was a singular talent, a master in their field. They were not just people. They were artisans of the senses. Julian Croft, the pianist. Elodie Renault, the perfumer. Marco Valles, the athlete, a master of his own body's physical limits. Their disappearances were too clean, too precise. It wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. It was a harvest. Her investigation had hit a wall. There were no leads, no witnesses, no connections between the victims. All she had was a gut feeling, a detective's intuition that these were not separate incidents, but chapters in a single terrifying story. She was hunting a predator of a kind she had never encountered before, one who didn't just kill their victims, but seemed to consume their very identity. She had no idea that her investigation was about to intersect with the nightmarish reality of 3 ordinary people who had been to a dinner party and had come back changed. The evidence she was looking for was not in a shallow grave or at the bottom of a river. It was living, breathing, and screaming in the tormented minds and bodies of Liam, Chloe, and Ben. The horrifying realization that they had participated in an act of cannibalism shattered the foundations of Liam, Chloe, and Ben's worlds. The immediate aftermath of their meeting was a descent into individual hells, each colored by the specific nature of their haunting and their own crumbling psychology. The knowledge was a poison, seeping into every thought, tainting every memory. They were no longer just haunted. They were complicit. The evidence of a monstrous crime was not at a crime scene, but inside them, woven into the very fabric of their cells. Liam, the rationalist, tried to fight his new reality with facts. He became obsessed with finding the source of his haunting. The phantom melody that plagued his dreams became his primary clue. He spent sleepless nights trawling the internet, listening to endless hours of classical music, searching for the beautiful, sorrowful tune. He finally found it in an obscure recording of a live concert, an untitled, improvised sonata performed by the celebrated pianist Julian Croft, the same Julian Croft who had vanished without a trace 6 months prior. The discovery was a sickening confirmation. He hadn't just eaten a random person. He had consumed an artist, and now that artist's final, unrecorded masterpiece was trapped inside him. He started drinking heavily, trying to drown out the music, but the alcohol only seemed to amplify it, the sorrowful notes a constant, mocking soundtrack to his waking nightmare. His hands, acting on their own volition, would often tap out the melody on his desk, his kitchen counter, the steering wheel of his car. It was as if Julian Croft's ghost was trying to play its final encore using Liam's body as its instrument. Chloe's emotional haunting intensified. The ghost of the perfumer, Elodie Renault, was no longer a fleeting presence. It was a constant companion. Chloe found herself inexplicably drawn to the places Elodie had frequented. She would wander into an old, dusty bookstore and feel a sense of profound peace, or walk past a specific garden and be overcome with the perfumer's nostalgia. It was a form of psychometry by digestion. She started researching Elodie, reading old interviews where the perfumer described her philosophy of scent, of capturing the memory of a moment in a bottle. The irony was a cruel, twisted joke. Elodie herself had become a memory captured in a person. Chloe's own identity was eroding, her emotions a chaotic blend of her own and the perfumer's. She felt like a vessel, a container for a dead woman's soul, and she was terrified that eventually, there would be no room left for her own. For Ben, the unraveling was a grotesque physical spectacle. His insatiable hunger became a form of self-mutilation. He ate until he was sick, his body bloating, his health deteriorating rapidly. The phantom pain in his side became more frequent, more intense. In a moment of drunken, desperate curiosity, he began researching the most recent missing person on the detective's list, the marathon runner Marco Valles. He found an article detailing Valles' career, and in it, a small detail that made his blood run cold. Valles had been forced to pull out of a major race the year before due to a debilitating, career-threatening stitch in his side, a severe muscle tear. Ben was not just feeling a phantom pain. He was experiencing the echo of a real, physical trauma, the ghost of a wound from the body he had helped consume. His own body, once a source of gluttonous pleasure, was now a canvas for a dead man's agony. He became a recluse, his grand house a prison where he was tormented by a hunger from hell and a pain that wasn't his. United by their shared horror, the trio knew they couldn't go to the police. What would they say? That they were being haunted by their dinner? They would be dismissed as lunatics. Worse, they could be implicated in the crime itself. They were the only living witnesses, the only link to the monster who called himself Chef Dubois. They had to find him themselves. Their investigation began with the only tangible link they had: the other guests. Liam, using his considerable resources as a journalist, managed to identify them. The Japanese art dealer, Kenji Tanaka. The Italian opera singer, Sofia Giordano. The French socialite, a young woman named Cécile Delaunay. He reached out to all three. Tanaka's gallery reported that he had gone on an extended, unplanned sabbatical and was unreachable. Giordano's agent claimed the singer had abruptly retired to a secluded villa, suffering from a severe and sudden vocal ailment. Cécile Delaunay was the most chilling. Her family, one of the oldest and wealthiest in France, reported her missing 2 weeks after the dinner. She had simply vanished from her Parisian apartment. It was a clear, terrifying pattern. The feast didn't just haunt you. It consumed you one way or another. The other guests were either in hiding, broken, or gone. Liam, Chloe, and Ben realized they were in a race against time before they suffered the same fate. Their only hope was to find Dubois before their own sanity, or their very lives were forfeit. Meanwhile, Detective Rossi's methodical investigation was slowly gaining traction. The disappearances of the city's artisans had been officially linked, forming a special task force under her command. The common thread was still missing, but she had a new lead. While re-interviewing the staff at Julian Croft's apartment building, a doorman mentioned something he'd previously dismissed as unimportant. A few weeks before he disappeared, Croft had been picked up for a private dinner by a fancy, unmarked car. He remembered Croft being unusually excited, saying he had been invited to a very exclusive, secret Epicurean society. The phrase Epicurean society was the key Rossi had been looking for. She began digging into the city's underground food scene, the world of private supper clubs and exclusive, invitation-only events. She put out feelers, using informants and undercover officers to infiltrate this secretive world. The whispers she heard back were faint, contradictory, but they all revolved around a legendary, almost mythical figure. A chef with no name and no restaurant. A man who curated transcendent dining experiences for a select few. The name Dubois came up once. A slip of the tongue from a terrified sommelier who refused to say more. The two investigations, one driven by desperation and the other by duty, were running on parallel tracks, hurtling towards the same monstrous truth. The breakthrough for Liam, Chloe, and Ben came from a place of deep darkness. Ben, his mind unraveling from the constant pain and hunger, remembered a small detail from the night of the feast. As they were being blindfolded, he had overheard the driver speaking softly into a hidden microphone, confirming the pickup. He had mentioned a name, the alchemist. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. They began searching the city's underworld not for a chef, but for a fixer, a high-end procurer of rare experiences known as the alchemist. It was Chloe, using her deep network of contacts in the service industry, who finally got a hit. A bartender at an exclusive cocktail lounge recognized the moniker. The alchemist was a shadowy figure who arranged impossible things for the city's elite rare wines, forgotten art, and, for a very select clientele, an invitation to the most exclusive table in the world. He was notoriously difficult to find, but the bartender knew someone who knew someone. After a series of tense, clandestine meetings and a hefty bribe drawn from Ben's dwindling fortune, they secured a meeting with the alchemist. He was a small, impeccably dressed man with the dead, emotionless eyes of a shark. He met them in a private room at a bathhouse, the air thick with steam and the scent of chlorine. "You are looking for Du Bois," the alchemist stated. "Not a question but a fact. This is unwise. Those who dine at his table are expected to appreciate the meal and then forget it." "We can't forget," Liam said, his voice a low growl. "We know what he's serving. We know who he's serving." The alchemist's lips curled into a thin, contemptuous smile. "You ate the greatest culinary creations of a generation. You were given a gift, a taste of another's soul. And you complain. You are ungrateful." "He's a murderer," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "A monster." "He is an artist," the alchemist corrected her. "And his art requires unique ingredients. He believes that to truly die is to be forgotten. He offers his subjects a form of immortality. Their essence, their life's work, lives on in the palates of the discerning few. He preserves them." The casual, clinical justification for the horror they had experienced was more sickening than any ghost. This was an organized, philosophical evil. Du Bois was not just a lone madman. He had an infrastructure. The alchemist was his gatekeeper. "Where is he?" Ben demanded, his large frame shaking with a mixture of rage and terror. The alchemist laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "He is nowhere, and he is everywhere. Le Festin Eternal is not a place. It is an event. It moves. The next feast is in 2 days. But you will not be invited." He stood to leave. "Consider this your only warning. Stop looking, or you may find yourselves on the menu." But as he walked away, Liam noticed something. The alchemist was limping, a slight but noticeable drag in his left leg, and Liam recognized it. In his research into the missing marathon runner, Marco Valles, he had read that Valles's career-threatening injury had been a torn hamstring in his left leg. The horrifying implication was clear. The alchemist hadn't just arranged the dinner. He had been a guest, too. He was one of them. The unraveling was not just for the diners, but for the enablers as well. They now knew they were not just hunting a chef. They were up against a cult, a secret society of cannibals who saw their monstrous acts as the highest form of art. And the next performance was just 2 days away. The alchemist's revelation that Le Festin Eternal was not a fixed location, but a mobile event transformed the nature of the hunt. Du Bois was not a monster in a lair, but a phantom, materializing to serve his horrific sacraments and then vanishing. The 2-day deadline hung over Liam, Chloe, and Ben like a guillotine. They knew with a chilling certainty that the next feast would mean another life harvested, another unique soul turned into a stew, and they knew that if they failed, the alchemist's threat would become a reality. Their own essences would be the next ones on the chopping block. Their only hope was to force the alchemist's hand. Liam, his journalistic instincts sharpened by desperation, came up with a dangerous plan. They would use the one thing they had that the alchemist feared: exposure. Liam wrote an anonymous, encrypted email and sent it to a select group of the city's most powerful journalists and law enforcement officials, including, though he didn't know it, Detective Rossi's direct superior. The email was a masterpiece of tantalizing horror. It spoke of a secret society, a culinary cult that catered to the city's elite, and hinted at a dark and unspeakable secret behind its ingredients. It didn't mention names or specifics, but it promised a full revelation in 48 hours. It was a bluff, a grenade thrown into the city's underworld, designed to smoke out their target. The plan worked faster and more violently than they could have imagined. The whispers of the email spread like wildfire through the city's elite. The alchemist, whose entire existence depended on discretion and secrecy, was suddenly exposed to the one thing he couldn't control: light. Less than a day later, a frantic, terrified message appeared on the burner phone they had used to contact him. It contained only a time and an address: a derelict slaughterhouse in the city's old meatpacking district. It was a summons. Simultaneously, Detective Rossi's investigation was reaching its own fever pitch. The anonymous email had landed on her desk, and it corroborated the whispers her team had been gathering. The term culinary cult connected directly to the Epicurean Society, mentioned by Julian Croft's doorman. She knew this was her break. Her team traced the email's encrypted origins, and while they couldn't pinpoint the sender, they found digital footprints leading back to the same shadowy corners of the dark web frequented by the alchemist. Rossi now had a name for her phantom. She put a high-priority trace on all of his known associates and digital communications. When the alchemist sent his message to Liam's burner phone, Rossi's team intercepted it. They had their location. As dusk fell on the appointed day, casting long, bloody-looking shadows across the dilapidated brickwork of the meatpacking district, the two groups converged on the same destination, unaware of each other's presence. Liam, Chloe, and Ben arrived first, their car parked several blocks away. The slaughterhouse was a hulking, silent ruin, its windows shattered, the air around it thick with the ghosts of 1,000,000 animal deaths. The coppery smell of old blood was overwhelming. "This is a trap," Ben whispered, his face pale and sweating, his large body trembling. The phantom pain in his side was a raging fire. "We don't have a choice," Liam said, his jaw set. His mind was a cacophony, the ghost of Julian Croft's sonata playing a frantic, fearful allegro. They found a side door unlocked and slipped inside. The interior was a vast, cavernous space. Rusted hooks hung from the ceiling on chains, swaying gently in the draft. The floor was stained with decades of blood. In the center of the room, a single, powerful halogen lamp illuminated a scene of terrifying preparation. A long, stainless steel table, a butcher's block, had been set up. Beside it was a mobile, state-of-the-art kitchen unit, a strange island of modern efficiency in the surrounding decay. This was the stage for the next eternal feast. A figure stepped out from behind a line of hanging chains, and their blood ran cold. It wasn't Dubois. It was the alchemist, and he was not alone. Two large, brutish men in butcher's aprons flanked him. "You were warned," the alchemist hissed, his voice echoing in the vast space. The limp in his leg was more pronounced now, a constant, irritating reminder of his own cursed meal. "You could not leave the masterpiece alone. You had to try and understand it, to tear it apart. Now you will become part of it." The butchers advanced. But before they could reach them, another figure emerged from the deep shadows of the slaughterhouse. It was Chef Antoine Dubois. He was holding a long, slender filleting knife, and he moved with a chilling, predatory grace. He raised a hand, and the butchers stopped instantly. "Leave them," Dubois said, his voice calm and melodic. "They are not ingredients. They are connoisseurs. They are my most successful critics. It is only right that they should understand the philosophy behind the art they have so intimately experienced." He gestured for them to approach, the knife held loosely in his hand. He was not threatening them, but inviting them into his world. It was a moment of supreme, terrifying arrogance. Liam, Chloe, and Ben, frozen by a mixture of fear and a morbid need for answers, walked slowly towards him. "You are haunted," Dubois said, his pale gray eyes examining each of them in turn. "I can see it. The pianist's frustration, the perfumer's grief, the athlete's pain. You think it is a curse. You are mistaken. It is a gift. You carry their essence within you. They are not dead. They have been transmuted. They have achieved a new kind of immortality." "You're a butcher?" Liam spat, his voice trembling with rage. "All chefs are butchers," Dubois replied with a serene smile. "I am simply more honest about my medium. I do not deal in the crude flesh of beasts who have lived lives of fear and filth in pens. I work with the vessel of the human soul. I seek out lives of profound passion, of singular, concentrated essence. A life spent perfecting one beautiful thing. That is a flavor that cannot be replicated. To consume it is to honor it, to preserve it from the meaningless oblivion of a natural death." He began to walk around the steel table, trailing the tip of his knife along its surface, the sound a high-pitched, nerve-shredding screech. Take Julian Croft, a genius, trapped in a frail body, his heart beginning to fail. He was destined to fade away in a hospital, his music silenced. I offered him a different end. A final, grand performance. His dexterity, his passion, his final, perfect sonata. They now live inside of you, Mr. Croft. He is more alive in your memory than he ever was in his dying body. He turned to Chloe. And Elodie Renault, a woman who lived in a world of scent, her heart broken by a lost love. Her grief was the secret ingredient in all her creations. It was her masterpiece. Now you carry it. You feel her sorrow as she felt it. Is that not the purest form of empathy? Finally, he faced Ben. Marco Valles, a body that was a temple of discipline and power, betrayed by a single weak muscle. He was facing a life without the only thing that gave it meaning: running. I took his vigor, his strength, his pain, and transformed it into sustenance. You hunger for his strength, you feel his weakness. You understand him in a way no one else ever could. It was a monstrous, seductive logic, the ramblings of a messianic sociopath who had elevated his pathology to a religion. He was not just a killer. He was a high priest of a cannibalistic cult, and this slaughterhouse was his temple. And who is it tonight? Chloe whispered, her eyes wide with horror, looking at the pristine, empty butcher's block. Du Bois's smile widened. A poet, he said. A young man whose words burn with a desperate, beautiful fire. His life has been one of poverty and heartbreak. His essence will be exquisite. As he spoke, the main doors of the slaughterhouse burst open. Police! Drop your weapon. The room was flooded with light and the shouts of heavily armed officers. Detective Rossi stood at the forefront, her gun trained on Du Bois. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then chaos erupted. The two butchers charged towards the police, creating a diversion. Du Bois did not run. He simply looked at Liam, Chloe, and Ben, a look of profound disappointment on his face, as if they had spoiled a perfect dish. You have chosen noise and ignorance over true understanding, he said, his voice barely audible above the pandemonium. Then he moved with a speed that was almost inhuman. He lunged not at the police, but towards the back of the slaughterhouse, disappearing into a maze of rusted machinery and hanging chains. In the ensuing confusion, the gunshots, the shouting Ben Carter, his mind finally snapping from the torment of his hunger and pain, let out a wild, guttural roar. He wasn't looking at the police or at Du Bois. He was staring at the alchemist, who was trying to crawl away in the chaos. You! Ben bellowed, his eyes rolling back in his head. You did this to me. He charged, a man possessed, a glutton driven mad by the ghost of the athlete inside him. He tackled the alchemist, his hands at the man's throat, a terrible primal scream tearing from his lungs. It was not a sound of rage, but of pure, insatiable hunger. Rossi's team swarmed them, but the scene had already devolved into a complete nightmare. The philosophy of the butcher had been laid bare, and its madness was now consuming them all. The raid on the slaughterhouse was a brutal, chaotic affair that ended not with a clean capture, but with a bloody, fragmented resolution. In the confusion, Chef Antoine Du Bois, the architect of the horror, vanished. He slipped through the labyrinthine depths of the old building and disappeared into the city's underbelly like a phantom, leaving behind only his chilling philosophy and a trail of shattered lives. His two brutish assistants were killed in the firefight. The alchemist was severely injured, not by the police, but by the maddened, desperate assault from Ben Carter, who had to be sedated by paramedics after being pulled off the wheezing, terrified fixer. For Detective Rossi, it was a partial victory tainted with the bitter taste of failure. They had dismantled the event, saved the intended victim, the young poet, who was found bound and gagged in a refrigerated truck behind the building, and captured a key conspirator. The alchemist, in exchange for a reduced sentence and protective custody, sang like a canary. He exposed a vast, international network of wealthy, jaded patrons who paid exorbitant sums to attend Du Bois's feasts. He provided names, bank accounts, and correspondence that revealed a secret society of nihilistic Epicureans who had convinced themselves that cannibalism was the ultimate form of aesthetic appreciation. The ensuing scandal was seismic, leading to arrests and social ruin in the highest echelons of society across the globe. But the master, Du Bois, remained at large, a culinary boogeyman. His legend now transformed from a secret whisper into a global headline. Le Festin Eternel was over, but its creator was free. For Liam, Chloe, and Ben, the aftermath was not a release, but a new and more public form of damnation. They were the star witnesses, the survivors. Their faces and stories splashed across every news outlet. They were dissected by the media, analyzed by psychiatrists, and treated as both victims and freaks of nature. Their testimony was the cornerstone of the case against the alchemist and the other patrons, but it came at a terrible price. They had to publicly admit to the act of cannibalism, an admission that made them pariahs. They were the people who had eaten people. The legal system didn't know what to do with them. They were witnesses, not suspects, but the horror of their experience placed them in a strange, unprecedented limbo. They were subjected to endless medical and psychological evaluations. The doctors could find no physical explanation for their persistent symptoms, but the psychological trauma was undeniable. The capture of the alchemist and the dismantling of the network did nothing to silence their inner ghosts. The hauntings were permanent. The essences of the people they had consumed were now a part of their DNA, a spiritual inheritance of ashes. Ben Carter's fate was the most tragic and immediate. His mind, already fragile, had been completely shattered by the confrontation at the slaughterhouse. The insatiable hunger and the phantom pains of the marathon runner never subsided. He was institutionalized, his vast fortune now paying for round-the-clock care in a private psychiatric facility. He spent his days in a state of torment, alternating between periods of catatonic silence and violent fits of a hunger that could never be filled. His body a living prison for his own gluttony and a dead man's agony. Chloe Reed abandoned her blog, her passion for food extinguished forever. The ghost of the perfumer, Elodie Renaud, became a permanent fixture in her life. She could no longer distinguish her own emotions from the gentle, persistent melancholy of the woman she had eaten. She retreated from the world, moving to a small, isolated cottage by the sea. She found a strange, sad solace in tending a garden, cultivating the flowers lavender, rose, jasmine that Elodie had used in her perfumes. She lived a quiet, lonely life, forever surrounded by the scent of a stranger's sorrow, her own soul a forgotten fragrance in the perfume of another's. Liam Croft quit his job. He could no longer be a food critic. The very act of eating was a source of torment. The phantom taste of the essence still home, still lingered, a permanent stain on his palate. He tried to rebuild a life, but he was forever changed. The ghost of the pianist, Julian Croft, was his constant companion. The sonata that had once been a source of terror became a strange, mournful comfort. He bought a piano and, over the years, his hands, guided by the memory in his muscles, slowly, painstakingly learned to play the piece. He could never play it with Julian's genius, but he could produce a flawed, hesitant echo. He became the reluctant keeper of the victims' memories. He used his journalistic skills to research their lives, to learn everything he could about the pianist, the perfumer, and the athlete. He felt it was his duty, a form of penance, to remember them not as ingredients, but as people. He wrote their stories, not for publication, but for himself, a private memorial to the souls he now carried within him. Years passed. The scandal faded from the headlines, becoming a lurid, half-forgotten piece of modern folklore. Liam lived a solitary life. One evening, as he was playing the haunting, familiar notes of Julian's sonata, he looked at his reflection in the polished black lacquer of the piano. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, the face staring back at him was not his own. It was a gaunt, pale face with piercing gray eyes. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Du Bois had never been caught because he had no intention of hiding. His philosophy was one of consumption and transmutation. He had not fled. He had simply moved on to his next project, his next artistic medium. Liam now understood the chef's final, cryptic look of disappointment in the slaughterhouse. Du Bois hadn't been disappointed that his feast was interrupted. He had been disappointed that they had failed to grasp the true meaning of his art. The eternal feast wasn't just the name of the dinner. It was a process, and it was not over. Liam knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his very core, that somewhere out in the world, Chef Antoine Dubois was still preserving life, still curating his monstrous sacraments. And he knew that he, Chloe, and the institutionalized Ben were the living proof of his success. They were his walking, breathing masterpieces, a permanent exhibition of his art, forever haunted by the unforgettable nightmare, an inheritance of ashes and ghosts. The feast was, and always would be, a part of them.